Dr. Naomi Evans pressed a blood-soaked towel against the broad, muscular shoulder of her last patient of the evening, her hands trembling just slightly. She thought the deep, jagged cut on CEO Kang Dae-seung's arm was the result of a mugging gone wrong. She thought the terrifying, dead-eyed stillness in his gaze was just the extreme trauma she had been hired to treat. But as she knelt in her dimly lit clinic, completely unaware of the lethal danger she was in, she didn't know the truth. She didn't know that the stressed corporate billionaire on her therapy couch was actually the apex predator of Seoul's most violent mafia syndicate. And she had no idea that the blood she was desperately trying to clean belonged to the men he had just slaughtered for daring to follow her home. Welcome back to Annie's Empire of Love, where high-stakes power bows to the raw truth of the heart. Today we are stepping into a story that will challenge everything you know about secrets, survival, and a cold mafia king who meets his match. Before we dive into this emotional roller coaster, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and leave a thumbs up on this video. Now, dim your lights, and let's find out what happens when the underworld collides with an innocent heart. Let's begin. The rain beat heavily against the frosted glass of Dr. Naomi Evans's modest psychology clinic in the heart of Seoul. Staring at the stack of overdue eviction notices on her desk, the brilliant but struggling black therapist rubbed her temples. She had moved across the world to build a sanctuary for healing, but compassion didn't pay the rent. She needed a miracle, or by the end of the month, her doors would close forever. Her miracle arrived not with a halo, but in a fleet of blacked-out SUVs. When the towering, stone-faced men in tailored suits entered her clinic, the air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. At the center of them stood Kang Dae-seung. To the public, he was the untouchable, icy CEO of Kang Holdings, a billionaire who ruled the city's shipping ports with an iron fist. But the rumors whispered something far darker. They said the man didn't have blood in his veins, only ice. He had been mandated by his corporate board to attend therapy after a violent public misunderstanding, and he had already psychologically broken 3 of the top psychiatrists in the city. He didn't want a doctor. He wanted a ghost. His right-hand man, a terrifying figure with a scar across his jaw, placed a leather briefcase on Naomi's desk. Inside was a retainer fee so astronomically high it would keep her clinic open for the next 10 years. But the money came with a suffocating catch. The CEO requires your absolute discretion, Dr. Evans, the enforcer stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. He slid a thick non-disclosure agreement across the desk, tapping a manicured finger on the final clause. He will come here twice a week, after hours. You will lock the doors, no staff, no cameras. But most importantly, you must follow the absolute rule. Naomi looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting the cold, dead stare of the billionaire standing silently by the door. You do not ask about the origins of his scars, the enforcer warned, leaning in closer. You do not ask where he goes at night. And when his eyes go completely blank, you do not push him. You look down, and you stay silent. If you cross that line, Dr. Evans, losing this clinic will be the least of your worries. Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at the briefcase, then back to the imposing, silent giant whose presence seemed to swallow all the light in the room. She needed the money to survive. With a trembling hand, she picked up her pen and signed her name, completely unaware that she had just signed her soul over to the king of the underworld. For the first 3 weeks, the therapy sessions with CEO Kang Dae-seung were a masterclass in suffocating silence. Every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the heavy oak door of Naomi's clinic would open. Dae-seung would step inside, always dressed in impeccably tailored, dark 3-piece suits that cost more than her entire annual lease. He would sit on the edge of the plush leather sofa, his posture rigid, his massive shoulders tense, and his dark, piercing eyes completely unreadable. He gave her nothing. When she asked about his stress levels, he gave one-word answers. When she probed gently into his childhood, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and that terrifying dead-eyed blankness would wash over his face. When his eyes go completely blank, you do not push him. You look down, and you stay silent. The enforcer's warning echoed in Naomi's mind during every session, and for 3 weeks, she followed the rule. She survived. She kept the clinic doors open, paid her overdue bills, and tried to ignore the overwhelming magnetic pull she felt toward the broken, silent billionaire sitting in her office. She told herself he was just a corporate titan dealing with the extreme pressures of the shipping industry. Nothing more. But on a bitter, storm-swept Thursday night, the fragile illusion of safety completely shattered. The rain was coming down in sideways sheets, hammering against the clinic windows. The clock on the wall ticked past 9:15 p.m. For the first time, Dae-seung was late. Naomi was just about to pack up her briefcase, assuming the weather had cancelled the session, when the front door violently clicked open. Dae-seung stepped into the dim light of the reception area. But tonight, there were no bodyguards. No blacked-out SUVs idling in the street. He was completely alone. Naomi instantly knew something was terribly wrong. His usually pristine charcoal suit was soaked with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his breathing that alarmed her. It was shallow, slightly ragged, the controlled breaths of a man fighting off immense physical agony. He moved with a heavy, unnatural stiffness, bypassing the reception area and walking straight into her office, collapsing onto the leather sofa with a low, barely audible groan. "Mr. Kang?" Naomi's voice laced with immediate concern as she rushed into the room. "Sit down, Dr. Evans," he commanded, his voice a gravelly, exhausted rasp. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the wall, his jaw clenched tight. "Begin the session. We have 45 minutes. Naomi stopped dead in her tracks. The scent of rain and expensive cologne was entirely overpowered by something heavy, metallic, and unmistakable. Copper. Blood. Her eyes dropped to his left side. His arm was pressed tightly against his ribs, and beneath the dark fabric of his suit jacket, a deep, ominous stain was rapidly spreading, dripping silently onto the hardwood floor. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. "Mr. Kang, you need an ambulance." "Let me call no." The word cracked through the room like a gunshot. Suddenly, Dae-seung turned his head, locking his gaze with hers. There it was. The terrifying dead-eyed void. The terrifying stillness of a predator that had been backed into a corner. It was the exact look the enforcer had warned her about. The look that meant she needed to lower her head, stay completely silent, and ask no questions. Naomi's hands trembled. Her mind screamed at her to follow the rules, to protect herself, to look away from the darkness radiating from the man in front of her. She knew a man like Kang Dae-seung did not get a wound like that in a boardroom. She knew there were dark, dangerous secrets hidden beneath his billionaire facade. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a terrifying CEO or a dangerous man. She saw a human being in immense, solitary pain. She saw a man who was stubbornly bleeding out in a chair because he had nowhere else in the world he felt safe enough to go. Naomi took a deep, steadying breath. She didn't look down. She didn't look away. Instead, she broke the only rule she had been given. "I am not going to sit here and ask you about your mother while you bleed out on my couch, Dae-seung," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror thrumming in her veins. She turned away just long enough to grab the heavy emergency medical kit from the cabinet behind her desk. "Dr. Evans," he growled, a low, dangerous warning vibrating in his chest. "Do not cross this line." "Take off the jacket," she instructed softly, stepping directly into his personal space, entirely ignoring his lethal tone. She knelt on the floor right between his knees, popping the latches on her medical kit. When he didn't move, frozen in absolute shock at her defiance, she reached out. Her warm, soft brown hands gently grasped the lapels of his soaked, ruined suit. Dae-seung flinched, his muscles instantly coiling for a fight. But Naomi's touch was so impossibly gentle, so devoid of fear, that it short-circuited his instincts. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who wanted to kill him, use him, or fear him. No one had ever touched him simply to heal him. Slowly, agonizingly, he allowed her to ease the jacket off his shoulders, followed by his ruined dress shirt. Naomi sucked in a quiet breath, but she didn't recoil. The man's torso was a terrifying canvas of trauma. Bullet wounds, old knife scars, and burn marks painted a violent history over his heavily muscled chest. This was not the body of a businessman. It was the body of a warlord. But Naomi swallowed her fear. forcing her hands to remain steady as she examined the deep, jagged laceration across his ribcage. She worked quickly and quietly, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, her delicate fingers ghosting over his feverish, scarred skin. Dae-seung stared down at her, his dark eyes wide. The dead, icy void completely shattered by confusion. He watched her long eyelashes flutter as she focused, felt the warmth of her breath against his chest, and felt the astonishing unconditional care in her every movement. She wasn't asking who did this, she wasn't running away screaming, she was simply saving him. "Why aren't you looking away?" he whispered, his voice stripped of all its commanding authority, leaving only a raw, ragged vulnerability. Naomi paused, pressing a thick bandage firmly against his side to stop the bleeding. She looked up, her soulful brown eyes meeting his intensely dark ones, the proximity between them suddenly crackling with an undeniable, electric heat. "Because pain shouldn't be ignored, Mr. Kang," she murmured softly, her thumb instinctively, gently brushing against an old scar near his collarbone. "And no one deserves to sit in the dark and bleed alone." In that exact, breathless moment, the ruthless, untouchable king of the soul underworld felt something in his chest completely give way. The ice that had guarded his heart for a decade cracked, splintered, and melted under the warmth of her touch. She had no idea she was bandaging the man who ran the city's most violent cartel. She had no idea she had just become the most important thing in his dark, violent world. When the heavy oak door of the clinic finally clicked shut behind Kang Dae-seung that night, Naomi collapsed against her desk, her legs entirely giving out. The room still smelled of copper, rain, and his intoxicating expensive cologne. Her hands, now scrubbed raw with hot water and antibacterial soap, continued to shake as she stared at the empty leather sofa. She had broken the absolute rule. She had touched him, questioned him, and looked directly into the abyss of his dark, terrifying eyes. For the next 48 hours, Naomi jumped at every shadow, waiting for the scarred enforcer to walk through her doors and terminate her contract, or worse. But the punishment never came. Instead, miles away in a glass-walled penthouse towering over the neon-drenched skyline of Seoul, the apex predator of the city's underworld was experiencing something he hadn't felt in over a decade. A complete loss of control. Dae-seung stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass of amber bourbon in his hand. Below him, his syndicate ran the city. The men who had ambushed him in the alleyways earlier that week had been methodically hunted down and eliminated by his lieutenants. His empire was secure, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Yet, as his syndicate doctors begged to inspect the wound on his ribs, the cold mafia boss flatly refused. He wouldn't let them touch it. He wouldn't let them unwrap the pristine white bandages Naomi had so carefully secured against his skin. Every time he breathed, the slight pull of the medical tape was a visceral, grounding reminder of her. He closed his eyes, the violent noise of his daily life fading away, replaced entirely by the memory of her warm, soft brown hands resting against his heavily scarred chest. He remembered the fierce, protective defiance in her soulful eyes when she refused to let him suffer. No one deserves to sit in the dark and bleed alone. For years, Dae-seung had sought out the city's top psychiatrists to cure the crushing, suffocating darkness that threatened to consume his mind. He thought he needed a doctor. But as he traced the edge of the bandage over his ribs, he realized he didn't need therapy. He needed her. He needed her warmth. He needed her light. And for a man who ruled the shadows, wanting the light was a very dangerous obsession. By the time Tuesday rolled around, Dae-seung didn't just want to see Naomi in the sterile, confined space of her clinic. He needed to know who she was when the doors were unlocked. He needed to know how she moved, how she breathed, and what made her smile when she thought no one was watching. The observation began quietly. Naomi never noticed the tinted, armored black SUV parked discreetly at the end of her street on Wednesday morning. She never noticed the cold, calculating eyes of the billionaire watching her from the back seat as she hurriedly locked her apartment building, balancing a travel mug of coffee and a stack of patient files. Dae-seung watched in absolute fascination as the fiercely intelligent, independent black woman navigated the bustling streets of Seoul. He watched her stop to buy a steamed bun from an elderly street vendor, gently pressing an extra tip into the woman's weathered hand despite her own obvious financial struggles. He watched her shoulders slump with sheer exhaustion as she waited for the subway, the heavy weight of the world resting on her delicate frame. In a city full of greed, betrayal, and violence, Naomi Evans was a walking sanctuary. She was pure, uncorrupted, and dangerously beautiful. Dae-seung's obsession rapidly deepened into a dark, possessive hunger. He found himself neglecting high-stakes cartel meetings just to sit in his idling vehicle outside a local grocery store, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar, possessive rage when a male cashier lingered just a second too long while handing Naomi her change. He wanted to shatter the glass, step out of the shadows, and remind the entire city exactly who she belonged to. But she didn't belong to him. Not yet. She still thought he was just a broken CEO. She had no idea she was being hunted by a wolf in a tailored suit. On Friday evening, the rain had returned to Seoul. Dae-seung sat in the opulent, dimly lit back room of his underground casino, the air thick with cigar smoke. His scarred enforcer, Ryu, stepped out of the shadows and bowed deeply, awaiting his next command. Dae-seung stared at the glowing embers of his cigar, his jaw tight, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "The therapist," Dae-seung commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a chill down his enforcer's spine. "Dr. Evans." Ryer blinked, his scarred face dropping into a frown. "Boss? Did she cross the line? Do you want me to terminate the contract and clear the clinic?" "No," Dae-seung growled softly, the word dripping with an absolute, terrifying possessiveness. He leaned forward, the predator fully awakened. "I want to know everything. Dig into her past. I want her bank statements, her debts, her family history. I want to know who broke her heart, who she owes money to, and what terrifies her at night." Ryu hesitated, a rare flash of concern crossing his brutal features. "Boss, she is a civilian. An American doctor. If you pull her into our world, if the other syndicates find out you have a weakness..." Dae-seung's eyes snapped up, locking onto Ryu with a lethal icy glare that promised immediate death to anyone who dared to challenge him. "She is not a weakness, Ryu," Dae-seung whispered, a chilling, obsessive smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. "She is my saving grace. Find out what chains are holding her down, because I am going to break every single one of them." The enforcer bowed sharply, stepping back into the shadows to execute the order. The line had officially been crossed. The cold Korean mafia boss was no longer just her patient. He was preparing to rewrite the entire underworld, just to make her his queen. The following Tuesday, the atmosphere inside the clinic was so thick with unspoken tension, Naomi felt like she was breathing underwater. She had spent the last 5 days trying to convince herself that the bloody, terrifying encounter with Kang Dae-seung had been an anomaly. She had meticulously rehearsed her professional script, determined to rebuild the boundary she had shattered. She was the doctor. He was the patient. He was a billionaire with a corporate mandate. She was a woman trying to keep a roof over her head. That was the reality. But when the heavy oak door clicked open at exactly 9 o'clock, reality evaporated. Dae-seung stepped into the room, and instantly, Naomi realized the man standing before her was not the silent, detached patient she had treated for 3 weeks. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a 3-piece suit. Tonight, he wore a crisp black button-down, the sleeves rolled up to expose thick, vascular forearms etched with faded, dangerous-looking ink. He moved differently, too. Gone was the rigid, guarded posture. He moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a predator who had finally decided to stop hiding in a cage. And the most terrifying change of all? He didn't walk to the leather sofa. Instead, he slowly closed the door behind him, the heavy click echoing in the dead silence of the clinic. He turned the deadbolt, locking them inside. Naomi's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she stood up behind her desk, gripping the edges of the mahogany wood to steady her trembling hands. "Mr. Kang," she began, forcing her voice into a calm, authoritative cadence. "Please, take a seat on the couch so we can begin." Dae-seung completely ignored her instruction. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly dangerously small. He began to slowly pace the perimeter of her office, his gaze dragging over her, from the crown of her gorgeous natural curls to the soft curve of her lips, and down to the modest professional blouse she wore. It wasn't a clinical gaze. It was a fiercely possessive, deeply masculine appraisal that sent a flush of heat straight to Naomi's cheeks. "You look exhausted, Dr. Evans," Dae-seung observed, his voice a low velvet rumble that seemed to vibrate straight through the floorboards. He paused by her bookshelf, casually picking up a framed photograph of her in medical school. "Dark circles under your eyes. Your hands were shaking when I walked in. Are you not sleeping?" "My sleep schedule is not the subject of our sessions," Naomi deflected sharply, her defensive instincts flaring. She stepped out from behind the safety of her desk, pointing toward the couch. "We only have 45 minutes, Dae-seung. Sit down." The sound of his given name on her lips caused something dark and primal to flash in his eyes. He set the photograph down. With slow, deliberate, heavy steps, he closed the distance between them. Naomi held her ground, but every instinct in her body screamed that she was in the presence of an apex predator. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away, entirely invading her personal space. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He towered over her, his broad chest blocking out the light from the desk lamp, trapping her between his massive frame and the edge of her desk. The scent of him, rich sandalwood, dark espresso, and an intoxicating, dangerous masculinity, wrapped around her like a physical weight. "I am not sitting on that couch," he murmured softly, leaning down until his lips were hovering just above her ear. "And we are done playing this game, Naomi." A shiver raced down her spine, but the fierce independence that had kept her alive her entire life surged forward. She tilted her chin up, refusing to cower, her warm brown eyes meeting his icy, commanding stare. "There is no game," she fired back, her voice breathless but steady. "I am your therapist. You are my client. You hired me to help you navigate your stress, and last week I overstepped my bounds as a medical professional to bandage a wound you refused to go to the hospital for. That is all this is." "Is it?" Dae-seung challenged, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Slowly, agonizingly, he raised his hand. Naomi gasped softly as his rough, calloused fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her jawline. The sheer contrast of his pale, heavily scarred hand against the flawless, rich brown of her skin was visually arresting. His touch was an impossible contradiction, so powerful he could snap her neck without a thought, yet so impossibly gentle, as if he were holding something sacred. He trailed his thumb over her lower lip, his dark eyes tracking the movement, watching her chest rise and fall with heavy, erratic breaths. "You touched me, Naomi," he whispered, stepping even closer, his chest grazing hers. "For 3 weeks, my men told you to keep your head down. They warned you of the consequences. But the moment you saw me bleeding, you didn't look away. You didn't run. You walked right into the fire." Naomi's mind was spinning, the professional boundaries she had sworn by completely melting under the scorching heat of his gaze. She tried to step back, but the desk bit into her lower back. She was trapped. I had to," she stammered, fighting the hypnotic pull of his voice. "I couldn't just let you. You have a dangerous habit of trying to save men who are beyond saving," Dae-seung interrupted smoothly, hinting at the dark intel Ryu had dug up about her painful past, though she didn't realize it yet. He leaned his weight slightly against her, caging her in with his arms resting on the desk on either side of her hips. "You are fearless, Dr. Evans. Beautifully, recklessly fearless. But you need to understand something." He leaned in so close their lips were a fraction of an inch apart. She could feel the heat of his breath, the intoxicating danger of his proximity. "I am not a corporate executive with boardroom stress," he warned, his voice a dark, thrilling promise. "And I am not a broken project for you to fix. If you keep looking at me the way you are right now, I am not going to let you look at anyone else ever again." The raw, possessive confession hit Naomi like a physical blow. The air vanished from her lungs. This was no longer a doctor-patient relationship. This was a man staking an absolute, territorial claim. She opened her mouth to protest, to push him away, to demand he leave her clinic, but the words died in her throat. Because deep down, beneath her fear and her professionalism, a spark had just ignited into a roaring flame. She didn't want him to step back. Dae-seung held her gaze for 3 agonizing electric seconds, letting the weight of his claim sink into her bones. Then, slowly, he pulled back, his eyes dark with a hunger he was barely restraining. He turned on his heel, unlocked the heavy oak door, and walked out into the Seoul night, leaving Naomi entirely breathless, gripping the edge of her desk, and utterly consumed by the spark she had just unwittingly struck. For 2 agonizing weeks after that electrifying confrontation, Naomi lived in a state of constant, breathless anticipation. Every time Kang Dae-seung entered her clinic, the air thickened. The professional boundary was technically still in place. They sat across from each other. They spoke about stress management and sleep patterns, but it was a thin, fragile veil covering a roaring fire. He no longer hid his intense, possessive scrutiny. His dark eyes tracked her every movement, watching the way her rich, dark skin caught the lamplight, noting the frantic, telltale flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat whenever he leaned just an inch too close. Naomi told herself she was safe. She told herself that despite his overwhelming dominance, he was just an ultra-wealthy corporate CEO with a protective streak. She was wrong. And on a suffocatingly humid Thursday night, the safe, pristine bubble of her clinic was violently, permanently shattered. The session had just reached the 30-minute mark. Naomi was jotting down a note, acutely aware of Dae-seung's heavy gaze locked onto her face, when the power to the entire block abruptly cut out. The clinic plunged into pitch-black darkness. The ambient hum of the air conditioner died, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence. "Don't move," Dae-seung commanded instantly. His voice didn't carry an ounce of surprise or fear. It was completely devoid of emotion, a terrifying metallic calm. Before Naomi's eyes could even adjust to the darkness, she heard the rustle of expensive fabric and felt his massive hand grip her upper arm, hauling her out of her chair and forcefully dragging her down behind the heavy mahogany desk. Dae-seung, what are? Crash. The thick, reinforced glass of the clinic's front entrance shattered inward with a deafening explosion. Heavy combat boots crunched over the glass in the reception area. Through the gap beneath her desk, Naomi saw the sweeping beams of tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness, accompanied by the distinct mechanical clack of assault rifles being racked. "Spread out." A harsh voice barked in rapid guttural Korean. "The Phantom King is in the back office." The boss said no witnesses. "Kill the therapist and burn the building to the ground." Naomi's blood turned to absolute ice. The Phantom King? Kill the therapist? Panic, sharp and blinding, seized her throat. She clamped her hands over her mouth to muffle a scream, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. These weren't corporate spies. This was a heavily armed hit squad. And they were here for the man crouched beside her. She turned her head, terrified out of her mind, and looked at Dae-seung in the shadows. What she saw completely shattered her reality. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't dialing the police. The stressed billionaire was entirely gone. In his place was a stone-cold apex predator in his natural habitat. His face was a mask of pure, lethal apathy. Without taking his eyes off the doorway, he reached inside his tailored suit jacket and smoothly withdrew a sleek, suppressed tactical handgun. Naomi stared at the weapon in absolute horror. CEOs do not carry suppressed weapons. CEOs do not look at heavily armed hit squads like they are mild inconveniences. Dae-seung looked down at her, his dark eyes locking onto her terrified, wide brown eyes. "Cover your ears, Naomi," he whispered softly, his voice an eerie, deadly caress. "And do not close your eyes. You need to see exactly who I am." Before she could process his words, Dae-seung moved. He didn't stay behind the desk. He rose with the terrifying, fluid grace of a shadow and stepped directly into the open doorway of the office. The first 2 hitmen swung their rifles toward him. They never even got the chance to pull the trigger. Thwip. Thwip. 2 muffled shots echoed through the clinic. The tactical flashlights hit the floor as both men dropped instantly, perfectly placed bullet holes right between their eyes. Naomi clamped her hands over her ears, a whimpering gasp escaping her lips as the smell of copper and burnt cordite filled the sterile air of her sanctuary. The third and final man, massive and heavily tattooed, let out a roar of rage and charged. Dae-seung didn't even raise his gun. He sidestepped the man's wild lunge, grabbed the back of the assassin's tactical vest, and ruthlessly slammed him face first into Naomi's medical cabinet. Glass shattered in a rain of jagged shards as Dae-seung kicked the back of the man's knee, forcing him to the ground. Dae-seung stepped firmly onto the center of the man's back, pinning him to the floor amidst the ruined medical supplies. He pressed the hot muzzle of his suppressed weapon directly against the back of the assassin's head. "Who sent you?" Dae-seung asked, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the ruined clinic. It was the voice of a king speaking to an insect. The Lee Syndicate," the man choked out, coughing up blood. "They said you were vulnerable. They said you were distracted by the American doctor." A low, dark chuckle vibrated in Dae-seung's chest. It was the most terrifying sound Naomi had ever heard. "Tell Lee," Dae-seung whispered, his tone dripping with demonic authority, "that the king of the soul underworld does not get distracted. He gets territorial. And because he sent you into her sanctuary, I am going to paint the streets with his entire bloodline." Thwip. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, a violent sob tearing from her throat as the final body went limp. Suddenly, the emergency backup generators kicked on. The clinic was bathed in a harsh, flickering red light. Naomi slowly lowered her hands from her ears, her entire world spinning out of control. Her beautiful healing sanctuary was completely destroyed. The pristine white walls were painted with blood. Armed men lay dead on her floor. And standing in the center of the carnage was Kang Dae-seung. He was breathing steadily, his expensive suit perfectly intact, the gun still dangling casually from his long, pale fingers. Slowly, he turned his head to look at her, the dead, icy void completely consuming his eyes. The veil had entirely dropped. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a corporate titan dealing with stress. The man who had been sitting on her therapy couch, the man whose wounds she had bandaged, the man who had stroked her jaw and sparked an undeniable fire in her soul, was the most dangerous, violent cartel boss in the country. Dae-seung took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the glass crunching under his leather shoes. "Don't," Naomi choked out, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall, her chest heaving with absolute, primal panic. "Stay away from me. Oh my God. What are you?" Dae-seung stopped. The sight of her profound terror, the realization that she was finally looking at the monster hiding inside the man, caused a dark, possessive shadow to fall over his face. "I told you I was not a project to be fixed. Dr. Evans," he murmured, his voice dropping into a lethal, uncompromising command. He raised the gun, swiftly ejecting the magazine and catching it with one hand to show her he wouldn't hurt her. "But you know my secret now. And in my world, there are only two things we do with people who know our secrets. We bury them, or we claim them." His dark eyes locked onto hers, burning with an obsession that terrified her more than the dead bodies on the floor. "And I am never letting you go." The silence following Dae-seung's dark, absolute decree was deafening. The flickering red light of the emergency generator cast terrifying shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp, aristocratic lines of a man entirely comfortable surrounded by death. Naomi's mind, trained to remain calm in crises, completely short-circuited. "We bury them, or we claim them. And I am never letting you go." "You're insane," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she barely recognized it. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively using the heavy mahogany desk as a barrier between her and the apex predator standing in the center of her ruined clinic. "I won't tell anyone. I signed the ENDA. I didn't see anything. Just let me walk out that door, Dae-seung. Please." Dae-seung didn't move a single muscle, but his dark eyes tracked her erratic movements like a hawk watching a cornered dove. "The Lee Syndicate knows you exist," he stated, his voice a low, emotionless rumble that cut right through her panic. "They tracked me here, which means they will track you. If you walk out that door, Naomi, you will be dead before sunrise. Because of you." She screamed, the sheer terror finally fracturing into desperate anger. Tears of sheer overwhelm spilled over her dark lashes. "I just wanted to heal people. I just wanted to keep my doors open. You brought this war into my life." "Yes," he agreed simply, stepping over the glass with agonizing slowness. "I did. And now, I am going to keep you alive. You are coming with me." "No." Naomi spun around, lunging for the back exit of her office that led to the alleyway. She was fast, fueled by raw adrenaline, but Dae-seung was a phantom. Before her hand could even close around the brass doorknob, a massive, unyielding arm wrapped securely around her waist, lifting her entirely off her feet. Naomi let out a choked cry, kicking and thrashing wildly against his solid, heavily muscled frame. "Let me go. Stop," she cried, swinging her elbow backward. She struck his chest hard, right over the ribs she had bandaged weeks ago. Dae-seung let out a sharp guttural hiss of pain, but his grip didn't loosen an inch. Instead, he spun her around, pressing her back flush against the heavy wooden door, using his imposing size to completely cage her in. He caught both of her flailing wrists in one of his massive hands, pinning them firmly but gently above her head against the wood. "Stop fighting me," he growled, his voice dropping into a dark, commanding velvet right against her ear. The scent of him, gunpowder, blood and rich sandalwood, was completely suffocating. "I am not going to hurt you, Naomi. Look at me. You just executed 3 men in my office." She sobbed, her chest heaving as she refused to meet his eyes, turning her face away. "You're a monster. You're the king of the underworld." Dae-seung's free hand came up, his rough, calloused fingers gently gripping her jaw, forcing her to look at him. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity so raw, so fiercely territorial, it made her breath catch. "I am whatever I need to be to ensure you survive," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone, wiping away a stray tear. The sheer contrast between the brutal violence he had just committed and the desperate, adoring gentleness of his touch was a psychological mind game Naomi couldn't comprehend. "The veil is gone, Doctor. You see exactly what I am. But you are the only light I have found in 10 years of darkness, and I will burn this entire city to ash before I let anyone touch you. Do you understand?" Naomi stared into his eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the absolute terrifying truth in his gaze. He wasn't kidnapping her. He was building a fortress around her, and he was using his own body as the gates. Suddenly, the harsh screech of tires outside broke the tension. Headlights swept across the shattered glass of the clinic front. Dae-seung instantly released her wrists, seamlessly transitioning from an obsessed lover to a lethal tactician. He pulled her flush against his side, wrapping his arm tightly around her shoulders as heavy footsteps rushed into the clinic. "Boss." It was Ryu. The scarred enforcer stepped into the office, flanked by 4 heavily armed guards in tactical gear. Ryu took one look at the bodies on the floor and the blood on the walls, his expression remaining entirely stoic. "The perimeter is secure. The police scanners are silent. We bought the precinct for the night," Ryer reported, his eyes briefly flickering to Naomi, who was trembling violently against Dae-seung's chest. "Transport is waiting in the alley. The Lee Syndicate is mobilizing." "Burn it," Dae-seung commanded coldly, not taking his eyes off the exit. Naomi gasped, struggling against his hold. No, my clinic. Everything I have is in here. My records, my life. Your life is with me now," Dae-seung interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked down at her, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "Everything you lose tonight, I will replace tenfold. But right now, we are leaving." Without waiting for her consent, Dae-seung scooped her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her bridal style out the back door into the rain-slicked alleyway. Naomi buried her face in his chest, entirely overwhelmed by the adrenaline, the fear, and the undeniable, terrifying fact that the safest place in the world for her right now was in the arms of the devil himself. As they settled into the back of the armored SUV, the vehicle speeding off into the neon-lit Seoul night, Naomi looked back through the tinted window. Bright orange flames were already licking at the roof of her clinic, entirely consuming her old life. She turned her head to look at Dae-seung. He was sitting completely still, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. But his large, calloused hand reached across the leather seat, firmly clasping hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The psychological war had officially begun. She was terrified of the monster he was, but as the shadows of the underworld rapidly closed in around her, she realized she was even more terrified of losing his protection. For 3 agonizing days, the penthouse at the very top of the Kang Holdings tower felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage suspended above the clouds of Seoul. Naomi paced the length of the ultra-modern glass-walled living room, her bare feet entirely silent against the heated marble floors. She had been given everything she could possibly need: silk robes, exquisite meals prepared by a private chef, and a view of the city that money couldn't buy. But she was a prisoner. The heavy, reinforced steel doors of the penthouse were guarded around the clock by men armed with assault rifles. And then, there was Dae-seung. He moved through the penthouse like a storm barely contained. He spent his days in the war room down the hall, barking lethal, blood-chilling orders in rapid Korean as he systematically dismantled the Lee Syndicate's operations across the city. But the moment he stepped into the living quarters with Naomi, the violent mob boss vanished, replaced by an intensely protective, obsessively gentle shadow. He would sit across from her in silence, his dark eyes tracking her every breath, drinking in the sight of her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to his sanity. On the evening of the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Dae-seung entered the living room wearing a pitch-black tactical turtleneck and a Kevlar vest. The sight of it made Naomi's breath hitch. He was strapping a combat knife to his thigh, his jaw locked in a rigid, unforgiving line. "I have to leave," he stated, his voice a low, heavy vibration that commanded the room. "We found Lee's primary compound. I am ending this war tonight." Naomi crossed her arms, trying to suppress the involuntary shiver of fear that raced down her spine. "And me? I just stay locked in this glass box?" Dae-seung crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped right in front of her, the overwhelming scent of dark espresso and impending violence radiating off him. He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his dark eyes softening into a profound, terrifying adoration. "You stay where I know you are untouchable," he murmured softly, leaning his forehead against hers. "Ryu is staying behind with 20 of my best men. The elevator codes have been scrambled. If the alarms sound, Ryu will put you in the titanium panic room behind the library. Do not hesitate, Naomi. You run, and you lock the door." "Dae-seung," she whispered, her heart hammering against his chest. She hated the violence, she hated the cage, but the thought of him walking out into a war zone tore at her completely. "Come back." A dark, incredibly arrogant smirk touched his lips. "I am the Phantom King Naomi Evans. Death answers to me." He pressed a fierce, lingering kiss to her forehead. "I will be back before sunrise." When the heavy steel doors locked behind him, the penthouse fell into a suffocating, echoing silence. Naomi tried to distract herself by reading a book in the massive library, but the words blurred together. The hours crawled by. Midnight passed. Then 1:00 a.m. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the absolute worst-case scenario became a reality. The penthouse didn't violently explode. There were no alarms. Instead, with a soft, mechanical click, the entire power grid of the skyscraper was cleanly severed. The penthouse plunged into absolute darkness. The ambient hum of the city below vanished. Naomi stood up, the book slipping from her hands and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Her pulse roared in her ears. The panic room. Dae-seung's orders echoed in her mind. She sprinted toward the back of the library, feeling her way along the bookshelves. Before she could reach the hidden panel, the heavy oak doors of the library were violently kicked open. "Dr. Evans." A voice hissed in the darkness. It was Ryu. A beam from a tactical flashlight cut through the room, catching Naomi's terrified face. But the towering enforcer wasn't his usual stoic self. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his hand clamped over his shoulder, thick, dark blood seeping between his fingers. "Ryu." Naomi gasped, rushing toward him, her medical instincts immediately overriding her fear. "Don't touch me," Ryu gritted out, shoving her backward toward the panic room. "We have a rat." Someone on the inside disabled the security protocols. "The Lee Syndicate is in the elevator shafts. They bypassed the outer perimeter. You have to get in the room now." Before Ryu could input the biometric code to the panic room, a blinding flashbang grenade was tossed into the library. The explosion was deafening. White light seared Naomi's retinas, and the concussive force threw her violently to the floor. Her ears rang with a high-pitched, agonizing squeal. She was completely disoriented, the world spinning wildly out of focus. Through the blur and the ringing, she saw heavy boots enter the room. Suppressed gunshots thwipped through the air. She saw Ryu's massive frame hit the ground, struggling fiercely but ultimately overwhelmed by 6 heavily armed mercenaries. Rough, unforgiving hands grabbed Naomi by her hair and the collar of her silk robe, dragging her ruthlessly to her feet. She screamed, thrashing wildly, but the men were enormous and unyielding. They dragged her out of the library and back into the glass-walled living room. The moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the absolute carnage. The Kang Holdings security detail had been slaughtered. Standing in the center of the room was a slender, sharp-featured man in a white suit. He held a gold-plated handgun, his face twisted into a vicious, triumphant smile. This was Lee. So, Lee purred, walking toward Naomi as his men forced her to her knees on the marble floor. He grabbed her chin roughly, examining her face. This is the little American doctor who melted the Phantom King's icy heart. I must admit, I expected someone more heavily armed. Go to hell, Naomi spat, her brown eyes flashing with a fierce, unbreakable defiance. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to cower. Lee laughed, a cold, grating sound. He stepped back and pulled a satellite phone from his pocket, dialing a number and putting it on speaker. It only rang once. Lee. Dae-seung's voice vibrated through the speaker. It wasn't angry, it was terrifyingly, entirely dead. He already knew. Hello, Kang. Lee gloated, pressing the cold muzzle of the gold-plated gun directly against Naomi's temple. Your fortress wasn't as impenetrable as you thought. Your men are dead, and I am currently looking at the gorgeous skyline of Seoul with your precious little therapist. A heavy, absolute silence stretched over the phone line. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Naomi closed her eyes, the cold steel of the gun biting into her skin. If you pull that trigger, Lee, Dae-seung finally whispered, the sound vibrating with a demonic, biblical rage that made the mercenaries in the room physically flinch. There is not a hole deep enough in this earth to hide you. I will flay you alive, and I will make your children watch. Big words for a man who is currently an hour across town, Lee sneered, cocking the hammer of the gun back with a loud final click. I am going to blow her brains out across your expensive marble, and then I am going to take your city. Say goodbye to your weakness, Phantom King. Dae-seung. Naomi screamed as Lee's finger tightened on the trigger. The climax was entirely unavoidable. The trap was sprung, the queen was captured, and the king of the underworld was about to unleash a hell Seoul had never seen. Lee's finger curled around the trigger. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing completely stopping in her chest. She braced for the blinding pain, for the end of her life in a city thousands of miles away from home. But the gunshot never came. Instead, a profound, unnatural vibration rattled the floorboards of the penthouse. The ambient sound of the city was suddenly drowned out by a deafening, rhythmic, mechanical roar outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Thwump, thwump, thwump. The wind outside whipped into a violent frenzy. Lee faltered, his vicious smile faltering as he ripped his gaze away from Naomi to look at the glass. The moonlight was entirely blotted out by a massive, pitch-black tactical helicopter hovering mere feet away from the side of the skyscraper. I told you, Lee. Dae-seung's voice crackled through the satellite phone on the marble floor, the sound no longer dead, but vibrating with a demonic absolute promise of death. I am the Phantom King. Death answers to me. Before Lee could even open his mouth to scream an order, the reinforced glass windows of the penthouse violently imploded. Deafening explosions shattered the entire wall of the living room, sending a hurricane of jagged, glittering shards raining across the marble floor. The harsh wind howled into the room, blinding the mercenaries. From the belly of the hovering chopper, a shadow detached itself, swinging through the shattered opening on a tactical rappel line. Kang Dae-seung didn't land. He struck like a god of war. Before his combat boots even hit the marble, his arms snapped forward. The heavy combat knife he had strapped to his thigh earlier flew across the room in a lethal blur, burying itself to the hilt directly into the throat of the mercenary, whose hands were still grabbing Naomi's shoulders. The man choked, releasing her instantly as he collapsed backward in a spray of dark crimson. Naomi hit the floor, covering her head as total, absolute carnage erupted. Lee stumbled back, screaming in raw panic, raising his gold-plated gun blindly toward the shattered window. But Dae-seung was already a ghost. The Korean mafia boss unclipped his harness mid-air, rolling across the glass-covered floor and coming up behind the nearest heavily armed mercenary. With one fluid, brutal motion, Dae-seung snapped the man's neck, using the falling body as a human shield against a barrage of panicked gunfire from the remaining 3 guards. Dae-seung withdrew his suppressed tactical handgun from his shoulder holster. He didn't fire wildly. His movements were terrifyingly cold, precise, and ruthlessly efficient. He stepped out from behind the body shield, entirely unfazed by the bullets tearing through the air inches from his face. Thwip. 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 3 shots, 3 hollow thuds as the remaining 3 mercenaries dropped dead instantly, perfect shots straight through their tactical visors. The violent ballet of death lasted less than 10 seconds. The penthouse fell dead silent, save for the howling wind whipping through the destroyed windows and the heavy, terrified gasps of the only enemy left standing. Lee was backed against the far wall of the living room, completely humbled, his entire body shaking as he stared at the absolute slaughter of his elite hit squad. He raised his gold gun with both hands, aiming it at Dae-seung's chest, but his arms were trembling so violently he couldn't hold it straight. Dae-seung stood in the center of the ruined penthouse, glass crunching under his boots. He was a terrifying sight, his black tactical gear dusted with glass, his eyes devoid of any human mercy. He looked like the devil himself, summoned straight from hell to protect the one thing he loved. He didn't look at Lee immediately. He looked at Naomi, who was huddled on the floor, trembling but alive. A muscle feathered in his jaw, confirming she was entirely unharmed. Then, slowly, the apex predator turned his attention entirely to the rat against the wall. "Stay back." Lee screamed, his voice cracking, the arrogance completely stripped from his tone. "I'll shoot. I swear to God, Kang, I'll put a bullet in your heart." Dae-seung didn't stop. He walked forward, his heavy footsteps echoing like a death knell. He didn't even raise his own weapon. He just holstered it. "You don't understand, Lee," Dae-seung murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that chilled the blood in Naomi's veins. He was stalking toward the rival boss with his hands completely empty. "You didn't just break into my territory. You didn't just kill my men. You put a gun to the head of my queen. Stay back," Lee shrieked, pulling the trigger. Bang! The bullet grazed Dae-seung's tactical vest, slicing a shallow, bloody line across his bicep. Dae-seung didn't even flinch. He didn't slow his pace. The pain didn't even register in his dark, obsessive eyes. The sight of a man entirely impervious to a bullet absolutely shattered what was left of Lee's sanity. Before Lee could fire a second shot, Dae-seung was on him. His massive hand clamped around Lee's wrist with bone-crushing force. Lee let out a high-pitched wail as the gold gun was twisted violently from his grip, clattering uselessly to the floor. Dae-seung grabbed the rival boss by the throat of his ruined white suit, lifting him entirely off his feet and slamming him into the concrete pillar with enough force to crack the stone. "Please," Lee begged, tears streaming down his face as his legs kicked uselessly in the air, clawing desperately at the massive, scarred hand crushing his windpipe. "I surrender. Take the ports. Take the city. Please, Phantom King, spare me." Dae-seung leaned in close, his face inches from the man who had dared to threaten Naomi. The absolute, unyielding dominion of the underworld radiated from him. "The city was always mine," Dae-seung whispered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "And I don't want your surrender. I want you to be a message to every other syndicate in this country. No one touches her and lives." With a ruthless, terrifying swiftness, Dae-seung drove his knee upward into Lee's abdomen, followed by a devastating, bone-shattering strike to the side of the man's head. Lee went completely limp, dropping to the floor in a heap of broken arrogance and ruined power. He wasn't just dead. He had been utterly, completely decimated by the man he thought he could outsmart. The war was over. The bad guys were destroyed. Dae-seung stood over the body for a single second, his chest heaving as the adrenaline of the slaughter began to fade. The dark, violent mask of the Phantom King was fully locked in place. But then, a soft, trembling sound broke through the howling wind. Dae-seung. He froze. He turned his head slowly. Naomi was sitting up against the base of the leather sofa. There was a smear of dust on her beautiful dark skin, her silk robe was torn, and she was shaking from head to toe as she looked at the sheer, terrifying devastation he had just unleashed on the room. Instantly, the terrifying mob boss vanished. The gun, the blood, the bodies, none of it mattered. Dae-seung dropped to his knees, crawling across the glass-covered floor without a second thought, his hands reaching desperately for the woman who owned his soul. The howling wind from the shattered windows whipped through the ruined penthouse. but the only sound Dae-seung heard was the ragged, terrified breathing of the woman in front of him. He fell to his knees directly in front of Naomi, ignoring the sharp bite of glass biting through the heavy fabric of his tactical pants. He reached for her, his large, scarred hands shaking violently for the first time since he had built his empire. He was entirely terrified that if he touched her, she would completely shatter. "Naomi," he choked out, his voice a raw, jagged sound completely stripped of its commanding authority. He didn't grab her. Instead, his hands hovered mere inches from her face, tracing the air over her tear-streaked cheeks, entirely terrified she would flinch away from the monster she had just watched him become. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? God, tell me you're not bleeding." Naomi stared at him. The cold, impenetrable apex predator was entirely gone. Before her was a man on his knees, his tactical gear dusted with glass. A thin line of blood trickling down his bicep from the bullet graze, and his dark eyes wide with an absolute, desperate panic. She had spent the last month trying to fix him. She had spent the last 4 days trying to run from him. But in this exact moment, as she looked at the man who had just violently slaughtered an entire hit squad and jumped out of a moving helicopter solely to keep her breathing, all of her professional boundaries and fearful reservations completely crumbled into ash. With a choked, violent sob, Naomi didn't run. She launched herself forward directly into his chest. Dae-seung let out a sharp, breathless sound as her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. He instantly crushed her against his Kevlar vest, burying his face in her dark curls, his massive arms wrapping around her waist like heavy iron chains, locking her into his soul. He breathed in the scent of her, jasmine, terror, and life, and a profound, ragged exhale tore through his heavily muscled chest. "I thought I was going to die," Naomi sobbed into his shoulder, her fingers gripping the fabric of his tactical gear with white-knuckled desperation. "He had the gun to my head. Dae-seung. He was going to pull the trigger, and I thought I would never see you again. I would never have let that happen," he whispered fiercely, his lips pressing desperately against the side of her head, his voice rough with emotion. "I would have burned this entire city to the bedrock, Naomi. I would have torn the world apart piece by piece." The sheer magnitude of his confession, the terrifying beautiful weight of being loved so fiercely by someone so dark, shattered the last of Naomi's emotional walls. "Why me?" she cried, pulling back just enough to look into his dark eyes, her own brimming with tears and a raw, beautiful vulnerability. "I am a broke therapist from America. I don't belong in this world. I don't belong with a man like you. You destroy everything you touch. Why wouldn't you just let me go?" Dae-seung's hands cupped her face, his thumbs gently, reverently wiping the tears from her dark cheeks. "Because you were the first person in my entire life who looked at my scars and didn't see a monster," he confessed, the dark, icy void in his eyes entirely replaced by a desperate, agonizing adoration. "I live in the dark, Naomi. I have lived in the cold for so long that I forgot how to breathe. I hired the best doctors in the world to fix my head, but I was dead inside. Until that night." He gently pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as a shuddering breath left his lungs. "You touched my chest while I bled, and you didn't ask me for money, or power, or fear. You just wanted to heal me. You broke the rules to save a man you didn't even know. And in that exact second, I knew my life was entirely over. I didn't want the empire anymore. I only wanted the woman who made me feel safe enough to close my eyes." Naomi's breath hitched. She saw the absolute terrifying truth in his confession. He wasn't a ruthless king holding her captive. He was a broken, terrified boy desperately holding on to the only light he had ever found. "You terrified me," she whispered, her voice trembling, her warm brown hands reaching up to carefully rest against his strong jawline. "When the veil dropped, when I saw who you really were, I was so afraid of the darkness inside you." Dae-seung's eyes opened, locking onto hers with a piercing, raw vulnerability. "And now?" he asked, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, terrified of her answer. "Are you still afraid of me, Naomi?" Naomi looked around the ruined penthouse. She saw the bodies of the men who had wanted to kill her, and she saw the man who had brought a helicopter to a gunfight just to protect her life. She looked back at Dae-seung, seeing past the blood, past the tactical gear, and past the terrifying rumors of the Phantom King. She saw the man who watched her buy coffee from street vendors. She saw the man who brought down rival syndicates simply because they dared to make her cry. She saw a monster entirely devoted to being her shield. No, Naomi breathed, a soft, profound truth settling into her bones. She brushed her thumb over the curve of his lower lip. I'm not afraid of you, Dae-seung. I'm afraid of what you would do to the world if I wasn't here to keep you tethered. A sound that was half laugh, half sob broke from Dae-seung's throat. The king of the underworld completely surrendered. He leaned forward, crushing his lips against hers in a fierce, desperate world-ending kiss. It wasn't gentle. It was the desperate collision of two souls who had finally realized they could not survive without the other. Naomi kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands burying into his dark hair, entirely accepting the beautiful, dangerous monster he was. In the center of a ruined penthouse, surrounded by shattered glass and the bodies of his enemies, the terrifying mafia boss finally dropped his armor, and the innocent therapist finally found her home. 6 months later, the violent blood-soaked night in the glass penthouse felt like a lifetime away. High in the lush, secluded mountains overlooking the sprawling, neon-lit expanse of Seoul, an entirely new empire had been built. It wasn't a fragile glass cage in the sky. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern estate encased in impenetrable stone and steel, surrounded by acres of tranquil, heavily guarded gardens. But the most magnificent addition to the Kang estate wasn't the reinforced perimeter or the fleet of armored vehicles. It was the massive, state-of-the-art medical facility built directly on the western wing of the compound, the Evans Sanctuary. Naomi stood on the sweeping mahogany balcony of the clinic, the warm evening breeze gently catching the skirt of her elegant, flowing emerald dress. She held a pristine tablet, reviewing the discharge papers for 3 new patients. She wasn't just treating stressed corporate executives anymore. Funded entirely by the bottomless wealth of Kang Holdings, Naomi had opened a sanctuary for the victims of the city's underworld, women and children who had nowhere else to run. She was no longer a struggling therapist buried under eviction notices. She was the undisputed queen of the city's shadows, fiercely protected, immensely powerful, and deeply loved. A soft, mechanical hum broke the tranquility of the evening. Naomi looked down at the courtyard as a fleet of blacked-out SUVs pulled through the heavy steel security gates. The doors opened, and 24 heavily armed enforcers stepped out, instantly fanning out to secure the perimeter. From the lead vehicle, Ryo emerged. The towering enforcer's shoulder had completely healed, though a new, jagged scar peeked out from beneath his collar. He looked up, saw Naomi on the balcony, and did something that would have shocked the entire criminal underworld. The terrifying, ruthless second-in-command of the Kang Syndicate stopped in his tracks, placed his hand over his heart and bowed deeply and respectfully to the black therapist. Naomi smiled warmly, offering Ryu a gentle nod of acknowledgement. The men of the syndicate no longer just feared their boss, they revered the woman who had brought their king back to life. They knew the absolute golden rule of the new empire. Kang Dae-seung ruled the city, but Dr. Naomi Evans ruled Kang Dae-seung. The rear door of the armored Maybach opened. Dae-seung stepped into the evening light. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, looking every inch the lethal, untouchable Phantom King. He had just returned from a summit with the remaining syndicate leaders, a meeting where he had calmly, ruthlessly dictated the new laws of Seoul. There would be no more collateral damage, no more civilian casualties. Anyone who crossed those lines would answer directly to his blade. He moved with the heavy, commanding presence of a warlord. But the exact second his dark, piercing eyes found Naomi standing on the balcony, the terrifying aura completely evaporated. He didn't wait for his guards. He bypassed the main entrance, walking purposefully through the manicured garden paths until he reached the private stone staircase leading up to her clinic wing. Naomi set her tablet down on the glass table, turning to face him as he stepped onto the balcony. The undeniable magnetic spark between them hadn't faded. It had evolved into a roaring, unquenchable inferno. "You're home early," Naomi noted softly, her brown eyes shining with adoration. "I thought the summit would take all night." "The other bosses didn't require much persuasion," Dae-seung replied, his voice a low, velvet rumble. "Once I reminded them what happened to the Lee Syndicate, they were remarkably eager to sign the new treaties." He closed the distance between them, but he didn't immediately pull her into his arms. Instead, the terrifying apex predator, the man who held the lives of thousands in the palm of his hand, did the unthinkable. Right there on the balcony, in full view of his heavily armed guards patrolling the gardens below, Kang Dae-seung slowly dropped to one knee. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently taking her bare, delicate feet. He noticed she had kicked off her heels after a long 12-hour shift at the clinic. With agonizing, exquisite gentleness, he began to massage the arches of her feet, his thumbs pressing away the tension of her day. Naomi gasped softly, a flush of heat rising to her cheeks. Dae-seung, your men are right down there. Let them look, he murmured, pressing a reverent kiss to her ankle before looking up at her. His dark eyes were entirely stripped of their icy void, overflowing with absolute unconditional worship. Let the entire city see that the king of the underworld bows to only one person. How was your day, Naomi? We saved 3 women today, Naomi whispered, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, profound love. She reached down, her soft brown hands threading through his dark, thick hair. Your funding gave them a completely new life. My money, Dae-seung corrected softly, turning his face into her palm to kiss her skin. But your heart, Naomi. You are the one doing the saving. You saved them, just like you saved me. He rose slowly to his feet, towering over her, his immense frame blocking out the fading sunlight. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Naomi rested her head directly over his heart, listening to the strong, steady beat beneath his tailored suit, a heartbeat she had fought to protect, just as fiercely as he fought to protect hers. I am never letting you go, he whispered, pressing his lips to the crown of her curls. It was no longer a terrifying threat. It was the most beautiful promise she had ever heard. I know, Naomi smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck, looking out over the impregnable sanctuary they had built together. And I am never running away. The cold, ruthless mafia boss had gone to therapy to cure his darkness, but he had found something infinitely better. He had found his son. And as the night fell over Seoul, the city rested quietly, firmly held in the grip of a monster who had finally learned how to love. Thank you for walking this journey with us today. If this story touched your heart, please show some love by hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and tapping the notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment of this story? Until next time, my beautiful family, remember the golden rule of our empire. Because in Annie's empire of love, love is the fiercest weapon we have, and the only law worth breaking. Stay blessed, stay loved, and I will see you in the next story.